All right. Welcome again to the first unit conference. Here we go. So previously, we just looked at the New Zealand dollar and the stable token that unit is going to be releasing, the NZDU. Now we are pivoting to New Zealand's closest neighbor, Australia. So I actually also lived in Australia for 10 years. So we basically moved here with my family when I was about 15. And I finished most of my important schooling here as well, and have since actually moved now to Amsterdam. But definitely, I would say that of all the countries I've been in, Australia probably feels like the closest to home. I've got the biggest network there and everything, and it is also a very, very beautiful place. So looking forward to diving in here. As I'm going, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to just drop them into the chat and we can get to them later, or I can actually address them as we're going through. We'll see how we go. Awesome. So Australia is the 55th most populated country in the world and also has one of the lowest population densities, with only 3 people or persons per square kilometer. That is huge, and I can really speak to this as well. A lot of the touring that I've done with my band around Australia, you are driving through the vast, desolate wilderness of nothing for hours and hours on end, and it's an experience I've only actually had in Australia. Probably could be experienced in America, and I'm sure like some parts of Northern Europe, or even Russia. But for now, of all the places that I've been, this is definitely one of the most vast and one of the most empty, and also one of the most beautiful as well. But the population of this enormous landmass is only 25.5 million people. As of mid-year 2020, I didn't actually put that in, but that is when. And that is equivalent to 0.33% of the total world population. So yeah, enormous continent we can see here. It's basically even the size of Europe, I would dare say. So one wonders why they have such a terrible immigration policy, but that's another chat for another time. So Australia fact sheets, capital city is Canberra. So Canberra is actually quite central here. It's just a little bit northeast, southwest, my apologies, southwest of Sydney. Quite an interesting place for the capital city to be. I've been there a few times as well. And one thing I can say, which is actually cool about Canberra, is it was an extremely planned city. And so a lot of the roads, I forget exactly who the designer was, but rather than everything being gridded, as you would expect in somewhere like New York or whatever, everything is circular. And it's actually quite confusing when you're actually driving and looking at the maps, you know, like these big sweeping roads that kind of move all around the city. And so it is quite an interesting experience in that way. But I think that was probably the main thing I can actually remember about Canberra. Official language is English. I don't even know if Australians qualify to say that their language is English. Because sometimes we've kind of like, we've really like taken it to a different dimension. Even some English speakers that I know sometimes even struggle to understand the Australian accent, and even the way that I talk with my friends as well, because lingo is definitely a very big part of how people actually talk. The ethnic groups, so we have 25% English, we have 25% Australian as well. Probably worth noting that Australian being such a new country, the Australian ethnic group is probably just an amalgamation of Europeans. Then we have 7.5% Irish, Scottish, Italian, German, Chinese, Indian, Greek, Dutch, and quite a few others. So the major cities in Australia are definitely where you see the most cultural and ethnic diversity as well. Sydney definitely is huge. A very, very prominent Asian population, same with Melbourne as well. And I think this is probably due to the major universities that are actually there, because there's definitely a lot of foreign students coming in to actually learn and get into the universities, especially from places like China as well. 2 major denominations of religious sectors are Anglican and Catholic, which account for 36% of the Australian population, while the majority are secular. So of all the friends and people that I've met, very few of them are actually religious. So again, I think maybe it's just due to the fact that Australia has not, it's a very young country, so a lot of the people that actually made their way there perhaps invented some sort of new cultural aspect. You know. So brief history of the Australian currency. Australian currency commences with the first European settlement of Australia on the 26th of January, 1788. So the colony of New South Wales barely survived its first years and was largely neglected for much of the following quarter century, while the British government was preoccupied in 1815 with the Napoleonic Wars. Because of the shortage of any sort of money, the real means of exchange during the first 25 years of settlement was actually rum. So this is very interesting, and I wonder if this speaks to Australian drinking culture as well. I'm not really sure, but I think exchanging and paying with rum is a pretty funny thought as far as things go. Oopsie. So the first coinage issued by the colony took place in 1813, when Governor Macquarie ordered the middle of the 10,000 Spanish dollars sent by the British government to be punched out. This process created two parts, one small coin, which they called the dump, and a ring, which was called the holy dollar. In 1852, the Government Assay Office in Adelaide issued Australian gold pound coins. These weighed slightly more than the British sovereigns. And after gold was discovered in Australia, the Royal Mint opened branches in Australia. Now, many of the sovereigns minted in Australia were actually for use in India as part of the plan that the gold sovereign should become the imperial coin. As it turned out, India was already too entrenched in the rupee system, and the gold sovereigns obtained by the treasury in India never actually left the vaults. Most likely, they actually just got melted down and turned into some other things. The national currency was created in 1910 as the Australian pound, which in 1966 was decimalized as the Australian dollar, which is currently where we are today. And as mentioned, this was around about the same time that New Zealand also jumped onto the decimalized dollar. And I think it's even perhaps worth mentioning, due to the relative proximity of Australia and New Zealand, they do share a lot of things. And there's actually an open immigration agreement between the two countries as well, where if you're Australian, you can live freely in New Zealand, and if you're of New Zealand citizenship, you can live freely in Australia as well. So Australia has a highly developed and mixed economy. As of 2021, Australia was the 12th largest national economy by nominal GDP, gross domestic product, and was the 21st largest goods exporter and 20th largest goods importer. The Australian economy is denominated by its service sector, which in 2021 comprised 62.7% of the GDP and employed 87.8% of the labor force. Australia also has the 10th highest total estimated value of natural resources, valued at $19.9 trillion in 2019. Speaks to the enormous land mass again. Australia took the record for the longest run of uninterrupted GDP growth in the developed world with the March 2007 financial quarter. And as of June 2021, the country's GDP was estimated at $1.98 trillion. So Australia has the 15th largest consumer market in the world as well, and the second largest in the Southern Hemisphere, beat only by Brazil, I believe, which, considering the size of the Brazilian population, again, it speaks to the development of the Australian economy. Consumer spending in Australia reached $773.6 billion in 2019. And since the pandemic has retraced to 740 to 720 billion. Again, worth noting that in Australia, everyone is also getting stimulus packages as well. So I think a lot of the consumer spending was again bolstered by these payments, especially when I'm speaking with my friends and family. Their life kind of was continuing as normal, even without a job. So as of June 30, 2021, there were 2.4 million actively trading businesses in the Australian economy. According to the Bureau of Statistics, 2.3 million are small and medium-sized enterprises, accounting for 99.8% of all businesses. So Australians are actually quite entrepreneurial, I think, in general, and a large portion of the population, as mentioned before, do operate in the service sector. So we've actually got a lot of these sole traders or tradies, as they're called, which basically operate their own businesses as carpenters or electricians or plumbers. And it's a very, very common way to go about doing business, but also working for yourself. So I think a lot of these workers are actually quite empowered by the fact that they run their own businesses. And it's, yeah, very, very common in Australia. So 2020 to 2021, the three industries with the largest net increase, I'm not sure if I should say businesses were, but, oh no, yes. In businesses were the construction with an increase of 16.6 thousand to 410. So this is actually speaking to the registered businesses. Professional, scientific, and technical services, an increase of 14,000 to 316,000 businesses, and healthcare and social assistance with an increase of 10,000 to 159,000 total. So Australia's economy is very strongly intertwined with countries of the East and Southeast Asia, accounting for about 64% of the exports in 2019. China is in particular, Australia's main import and export partner by quite a wide margin. So a lot of the natural resources that actually are created or pulled out of the ground in Australia do go straight to China. And even perhaps worth mentioning that a lot of Chinese shareholders actually own businesses in Australia. And the Australian government, for better or worse, is definitely selling very long leases to Chinese companies for extraction of natural resources as well, which is fairly problematic, I think, in the long run. The country has also entered into free trade agreements with the ASEAN, Canada, Chile, China, South Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, Peru, Japan, Singapore, Thailand, and the United States. So in 2019, Australia was the world's top destination for millionaires, beating the United States for a second consecutive year. An estimated 11 million millionaires moved to Australia in 2019, compared with the 10,000 who moved to the United States. So, I mean, it's not far off how many millionaires moved to the US, but definitely, again, considering the actual population of Australia, it is actually enormously solid. But I wonder if this just speaks to the fact that Australia is still a very new country. I wouldn't say it's developing, but there's a lot of opportunity for people who actually have money to start businesses. And definitely, if you're in the resource extraction sector, it's going to be a field day. So Australia was especially attractive to Chinese millionaires due to its relative proximity, cleaner environments, political and economic stability, and investor visa programs. Also, the primary reason for millionaires leaving China is top schools abroad that will give their children a better education and career connection. So in 2020, the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report of Australia continued to have the highest median wealth per adult. The average level of real assets is 300 and let's round it up to 320,000, was the second highest in the world, just after Norway. And the report explains this partially reflects the large endowment of land and natural resources relative to the population, and also high urban real estate prices. Only 6% of Australians had a net worth below $10,000 US, compared to 29% in the US and 70% for the world as a whole. Australia's net external debt exceeded $1 trillion in April 2017 as a result of Australia's structural account deficits. Now, although these deficits have narrowed in previous years due to an increase in net merchandise trade, the 2021 to 2022 budget predicts that the Commonwealth Government's gross debt for 2020 to 2021 is about $8.29 billion, or about 40% of GDP. By June 30th, 2022, the gross debt will rise to $963 billion, or 45% of GDP, and then ultimately increase to $1.2 trillion. So this is quite crazy, actually, because a lot of the statistics that we're actually looking at here are actually from government websites. So to see that the government is actively and very transparently discussing debasement of the currency speaks to the fact that I think there's a large portion of people who don't really understand how that actually robs wealth from them in the long run. And I think we're getting to a point in human history now where a lot more people seem to be sort of waking up. And I guess now that we actually have systems and technologies that we could actually pivot to, things like Bitcoin, maybe now we're actually going to not repeat the same mistakes that we've repeated, because in human history, there have been 6 global reserve currencies, all of which have lasted about 100 to 150 years and ultimately failed. And so we've gone through this series of boom and bust, but perhaps because of the time between each of these cycles, it's long enough, it's like enough generations kind of go through that the knowledge doesn't seem to be getting passed down. And so here we are, as we're coming towards this point of, I don't know if we could call it some sort of singularity, but definitely everything is increasing at an exponential rate. And we've got to reach some sort of breaking point, or at least some moment of enlightenment where we collectively decide, or at least there's a majority who collectively decide that we should try and pivot to something else. Because this is concerning. And this kind of printing is actually, you you can actually see this in basically every presentation that I give. Things do seem to be getting quite out of control. So side note, how does the government debt actually created in Australia? So when the Commonwealth government wants to spend more money, then it raises the tax revenue, which is usually how it actually is going to be getting most of its money. It instructs the Treasury to issue debt in the form of bonds and notes or government securities, AGS. The government borrows money by issuing bonds. These are financial instruments. People lend money by buying bonds from the government, and the bondholder is then entitled to repayment as they can sell a bond in the secondary market, and thus the initial buyer need not be the same as the current holder. So ultimately, people are trading these loans around, and this can cause lots of problems when monetary debasement actually starts to get out of hand. But yeah, look, this really goes quite beyond the scope of the presentation, so we won't go too deep into it, but just an interesting note. Digital activity of Australia's economy. So the Bureau of Communications and Art Research, BCAR, and analysis shows that digital goods and services play a significant and growing role in Australia's economy. So similar to what's also happening in New Zealand, and I think a lot of the first world countries, there is this push towards autonomizing a lot of these systems. Ultimately, it just reduces overheads, but also adds, I guess, even more security, but also more, it's just faster, I guess, more efficiency to the entire system. So similarly with voting and things like this, I think we're going to see a lot of the governments incorporate online social service systems. Digital activity, which includes ICT and IoT, contributed about 119 billion or 7% to Australia's economy in 2016 to 2017. And according to the latest available data, ICT activity contributed 86 billion and IoT contributed 74 billion, totaling 160 billion. So we're just seeing this exponential increase again. Digitization is really taking control. Attitude and regulation of cryptocurrency in Australia. So I was in Australia when I first started getting involved with crypto and started trading. And I found the path to actually get involved was very easy. And for the most part, there were no loopholes. Australia is starting to really tighten things up now, especially with respect to tax. But we can look at that again a little bit closer shortly. And so, yeah, as mentioned, the Australian government has taken a largely non-interventionist approach to the regulation of cryptocurrency, allowing the landscape to evolve faster or as a faster rate than the regulatory response. Australian law does not currently equate digital currency with fiat currency and does not treat cryptocurrency as money. Fair enough at this stage. The Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia has also reported that the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, has no immediate plans to issue a digital dollar akin to money, terming it an AUDU. The governor did, however, note that the rise of new technology associated with cryptocurrencies has the capacity to challenge the role of traditional financial institutions, which is definitely pretty bang on. So the biggest companies in the cryptocurrency exchanges industry in Australia. So we've got Binance, who actually have set up a legitimate arm in Australia, and you've got Binance Australia Pty Ltd. And it is now possible to send money directly from your Australian bank account to Binance instantly using a Pay ID system, which is also pretty cool. You've got CoinSpot, SwiftX, BTC Markets, Independent Reserve. Independent Reserve is also one of the largest companies that operate in New Zealand as well. And then you've got CoinJar. So in June 2021, the top performing Australian exchanges hit a combined daily trading volume of 800 million against Australian currency pairs. And this is actually quite substantial when you do consider that most of the trading is actually happening to US currency pairs. This is still a large portion of trading happening to Australian currency. So this would probably be traders entering or exiting the market with their Australian dollars. By way of comparison, the ASX says that in June, it handled an average of 5 billion in trading volume. So this is encompassing all trades, not just ones going to Australian currency pairs, which is pretty solid. It's actually quite solid for a population that's not so large. So of the top 5 coins, Tether has been traded the most over the last 7 days, with more than 844 billion changing hands. These 5 coins have a combined trading volume of 1.51 trillion over the last week. and 7.39% more than the week prior. This showcases an enormous demand for stablecoins within the trading ecosystem. So actually, speaking to a question that I got earlier from Christian, this might actually very well be another aspect of how people could actually use the stable tokens issued by unit at some point. I think when the ecosystem or the tokenization ecosystem really starts to kind of develop and become more interoperable, it's going to be possible to actually send the unit tokens out of the platform and actually use them on different exchanges in different places as well. That could take quite some time. Maybe it's actually impossible. I'm not really sure about the technical aspects of that, but I think this would ultimately be where the world goes. And there is this fluency between different tokens and this understanding and communication between different tokens that can really allow the ecosystem to become extremely eclectic and diverse. So in conclusion, billions are changing hands via Australian digital currency exchanges. The estimated total buying and selling of cryptocurrencies in Australia was around 5.9 billion. This number is extrapolated from a survey of approximately 2/3 of the local industry, which reported 3.9 billion in transactions in 2017. The market growth and adoption of cryptocurrencies has gone from incremental to exponential. Very, very cool. And I think this is almost happening in tandem with monetary debasement by the government. So people seem to be becoming pretty aware of the, I guess, the safety and the opportunity that cryptocurrencies could actually offer if things start to get out of hand. And it's just one of those rare points in history where we actually do have something we can pivot to, which is really, really cool. Australia's DCEs, decentralized exchanges, are growing rapidly to keep pace with the market. So in total, the 7 exchanges have 312,000 unique customers registered, of which 232 were added in 2017. That is enormous. And so I think if I could actually find more recent stats, we'll probably see that number is a staggering increase on what is actually represented there. And the majority of cryptocurrency traders are males under 40. Interesting, but I think this is also going to change as people start to as all sorts of different people from different walks of life start to see the value in actually using tokens and crypto for getting on with their business and for growing projects and things that they're actually interested in doing. So yeah, I would definitely like to see that diversify a little bit more. I'm not actually sure why it is always males who dominate the financial sector. I was talking to a friend about this the other day and we couldn't actually reach any sort of conclusion, but yeah, anyway, that is where we are indeed now. So the AUD stable token by units, there's going to be a total supply of 100 million, ticker AUDU. And so the AUDU is a decentralized stable token issued by unit. And importantly, the biggest difference with the stable token that we're offering is that it is actually backed by digital assets instead of fiat. So this allows for over-collateralization of the underlying digital assets as they appreciate in value. So let's say as an example, you want to buy 50,000 AUD tokens using BTC. And BTC is at 50,000 Australian dollars. Therefore, the AUD token is 1-for-1 backed. So the BTC that you've just used to purchase the AUD token goes into the AUD token bank. It does not get locked in the treasury. This is an important differentiation between the stable token and all of the other tokens. The reason it sits in the bank is because when people actually want to trade out or exchange out, they need to be able to access those funds. If they're in the treasury, it's not so possible. So, however, if Bitcoin does increase to $100,000 per Bitcoin, the AUD token holders don't get that upside. They can't actually capitalize on that increase. The AUD token simply becomes over-collateralized and ultimately safer and more secure. And if it drops, then the AUD token bank reserves are only used to buy back the stable token if it is 2 times over-collateralized. Otherwise, the token bank will just let it drop and wait until the underlying collateral recovers. So we're going to get into more of the specifics on this a little bit later. This is just a very, very brief overview of exactly what the token is really doing and how the token is actually different. This is going to be issued on the unit network and initially is actually going to only exist and be usable within the unit ecosystem. But as interoperability between different platforms starts to increase, it's very likely that these could also leave the ecosystem as well. This remains to be seen. And so again, thank you very much for tuning in. Please, if you've got any questions, hit me up. I see there's some stuff happening in the chat. Driving in Canberra is totally confusing, says Brett. It really, really is. We were there with my band. We were on tour, and we were actually late for a show, and it was definite chaos to try and figure some of these things out. But I personally do like things that are done differently. I think why have the city always in a brick sort of cubist fashion? It doesn't have to be that way. I think things, at least roads that slope and wind and move, very, very nice. Yeah, mate, Aussie English, that's it, Dinara. Definitely is. And it seems like the more inland you go, the more it starts to deviate from English as well, because even I've met some people and they're dropping certain lingo that I just don't even fully understand myself. So it's always a bit of an adventure. And I think they take it upon themselves to constantly reinvent new slang and lingo as well, which is really cool.